Demoman is the most effective damage per second class in all of Team Fortress 2. He has 4 grenades and 8 sticky bombs that all have insane damage potential due to their high base damage and generous area of effect. Experienced demo players make server clearing look easy, but when you actually play as the Drunk Scotsman, you might come to realize that it's harder than it looks. Unlike his American friend who can rocket jump away at a whim, the Demoman's main movement ability comes with a 0.7 second delay, meaning he cannot easily reposition during a fight. Furthermore, his sticky bombs are clunky at close range, and just like his grenades, they deal self-damage. Because of the Demoman's inherent weakness at point blank, being successful requires disciplined positioning. As is generally the case with TF2, there isn't a strategy that works 100% of the time. The ideal place to be depends on various factors such as team compositions, the objective, your health, number advantages, and so on. Demoman's gameplay loop is pretty dynamic, so I encourage you to experiment and ultimately play the game the way you find the most fun. One thing does remain true in pretty much all situations. Demoman does not like it when his opponent is able to get right up in his face. Usually a point-blank encounter with a scout, Pyro, or soldier will give you a free trip back to your own spawn room. You can avoid the situation with your positioning, as well as using sticky bombs to limit your opponent's movements. What cannot be achieved with positioning or sticky spam alone is stopping a soldier from rocket jumping at you or a sniper peeking you from afar. This is where an extremely important but often overlooked pillar of TF2 theory comes into play: map control. What having map control essentially means is that you're able to traverse around certain areas of the map without greatly risking your life, while simultaneously preventing the other team from moving around freely. Without any space, you and your team cannot complete the objective. Being aware of what parts of the map are under your team's control and where the fight is happening is key to positioning as a Demoman because your ideal range is longer than most of the other mercenaries. You don't want to be walking around the map completely unaware, only to run into a Pyro because you weren't paying any attention to the game state. Sniper is probably the best example of why controlling areas of the map is very important. If a sniper is allowed to get set up on a long angle, the majority of classes cannot contest him. Combine this lack of map control with poor positioning, and you end up instantly dying from across the map. If you instead lock out the area the sniper needs to stand in to hold an angle, the sniper is not able to peek down that lane without dying. The most effective way to guarantee your team holds map control as an explosive class is to hold choke points. Choke points are everywhere in TF2, and they are important to consider when both defending and attacking. In order to maintain as much map control as possible as a demo, you will want to be locking down these choke points. The most obvious example of how defending chokes leads to map control might be a bit controversial, but spawn camping does a great job of demonstrating this concept. Putting a sticky trap right on the other team's spawn shutter forces them to slowly work their way out of spawn, and once they do break out, you can back up and hold the next choke point. By holding doorways, you are helping to organize the chaos of a pub. Demoman thrives in an orderly, stable environment, not chaos. If a lobby is chaotic with scouts running around freely, soldiers constantly getting behind, and snipers being left uncontested, you're going to have a pretty rough time. This is why choke points are so important. If you allow your opponents to walk through a choke for free, you might be forced to fight them out in a more open area, which isn't ideal. If your team is doing a bad job of holding doorways, this gives classes like Scout an opening to get up close to you, which you do not want. If a scout or similar does get close to you, the fight is still very much winnable if you hit your shots. That doesn't mean that this is ideal, since if you were playing at a longer range, you would significantly reduce the damage you took during the fight. Demoman is all about maximizing the amount of damage you deal and minimizing the amount you take. Anyways, I should mention here that not all choke points are doorways, and not all chokes are equally as narrow as each other. Some are easier to hold than others, but if you look around the map for the entrances to a point, you can easily identify what you want to be controlling. Demo is the strongest class when it comes to denying players from walking through chokes. Because he basically has 2 primary weapons that deal AoE, and he can sticky trap 2 or 3 doors, it is possible to deny multiple doorways at once, as long as your positioning is good. Speaking of positioning, I'll start with what I consider to be the first of 3 fundamentals of Demoman positioning. Ideal spacing on Demoman is dynamic, since team compositions and game state play a role in how aggressive or passive you should be. To give you the gist of it, you want to be at a medium distance that affords you an advantage because your stickies and pipes are more effective than your opponent's weapon. Playing at a medium range is ideal for a number of reasons. With sticky bombs, there is a sweet spot where you can shoot a bomb and then detonate as soon as its arm timer is up. Being too close makes stickies very difficult to use because your opponent can move out of the way before the sticky is armed. Being too far is better than being up close, but your damage potential is greatly reduced. For the grenade launcher, hitting direct pipes is also easier at this range. If you are too far away, your opponent can just react and move out of the way, and if you're too close, you take self-damage. At mid-range, you are close enough that your target doesn't have time to react to your shot, but far enough that you won't take any self-damage. Another reason that this mid-range is so important is because it gives you time to zone your opponent with sticky bombs should they attempt to push you. Having some space between you and your aggressor gives you time to place stickies down to slow them down, or outright kill them. There are some occasions where you can afford to ignore this advice and get up close, such as when you're Ubered because you don't have to worry about self-damage. A common mistake I see other players make is being too far forward when they get aggressive. Aggression is usually a good thing, but you should keep proper spacing in mind because good players will punish you if you don't. Being super close as a demo can work, but it is much riskier for the same reward. The final aspect of spacing deals with holding choke points. Obviously, I have already emphasized that chokes are super important, but your positioning should reflect your intent to hold them. Ideally, you want to distance yourself so that enemies who are attempting to break through a choke are entering your mid-range. Enemies entering a choke as they are entering your sweet spot mid-range will mean that they are at their most vulnerable at the range that you are capable of dealing the highest amount of damage per second without putting yourself at risk. This will maximize the amount of easy damage you can get. Obviously, depending on your team's positioning as well as the other team, this exact scenario might not always be possible. You are going to want to play around your teammates whenever you can since you aren't completely self-sufficient. Good maps have multiple entrances to a point. On these maps, you won't be able to watch every single entrance, so you will have to rely on your own game sense and intuition to predict where your opponents are going to go. Lastly, I like to keep the objective in mind as well. If I'm defending on payload, I'll play close enough to the cart that I can quickly turn my attention to it if needed. If I stop paying attention to the cart, somehow my team fumbles and lets the other team cap 9 times out of 10. When it comes to Demoman positioning, the typical list of good practices apply. Play on the high ground when you can, don't dilly-dally in choke points, use health packs to your advantage, and of course be aware of long sightlines. This is all good advice, but the second pillar of Demoman positioning is map geometry, since Demoman has some unique interactions when compared to the other mercs. Firstly, Demoman is uniquely capable of contesting players who have a high ground advantage. Because your projectiles travel in an arc, you can easily sticky spam or even pipe spam players who are above you. Compare this to a soldier on the low ground who needs to hit a direct rocket, or to any hitscan class who have a smaller target to aim at, and you can see how this is a useful ability. All the benefits of playing on height still apply to Demoman, so I would still recommend gravitating towards the high spots on the map, but there are situations where you can get a lot of value by approaching a fight from an unexpected angle. Another way map geometry dictates your positioning is corners. Playing as a class with a single fire area of effect weapon, you greatly benefit from corners. Obviously, I already talked about chokes, but when you combine lots of chokes with lots of corners, you get maps like Dust Bowl, which are basically demo main heaven. Anyways, corners can be used to your advantage in many matchups. You can shoulder peek heavies, pyros, and sentry guns, essentially reducing the amount of time you're in their line of sight, thus limiting the damage they can deal to you while still realizing your own full damage potential. To do this effectively, you want to hide around the corner and only peek out when your weapon is ready to fire. When you do peek, fire immediately and then get back to cover as soon as you can. Because your projectiles come out of the right side of your screen, it is a bit easier to do this when the wall covering you is on your left, but it is still doable the other way around. You can also use corners to shoot an opponent without even peeking them at all, since sticky bombs have a generous explosion radius. This gives the demo the upper hand when fighting classes that have single-fire hitscan weapons like Engineer or Scout. Corner peeking with grenades works pretty well, but it can sometimes be difficult to directly hit your opponent if you're being really conservative with your peeks. I generally prefer the sticky bomb launcher in this case because you don't need to land a direct hit, you can just shoot the ground instead. On the topic of generous explosion radiuses, you can also abuse many props found around maps to achieve a similar result. Not only can props be used to corner peek, but you can also shoot over many of them due to the arc of your projectiles. Because no other class has the ability to do this, you want to make sure to abuse these props as much as possible. If you get good at doing this, you can dish out lots of damage while avoiding taking any yourself. I cannot stress that last bit enough. Minimizing the damage you take is very important in pubs. Everybody knows that Demoman greatly benefits from having a medic healing him a lot, but in pubs this is definitely not the norm. If you take a lot of unnecessary damage, you will find yourself having to back up a lot, which gives up map control and ends up making your positioning worse. Notice how in this clip, I managed to dish out hundreds of damage without taking any at all. There's a bit of a learning curve to abusing your projectile arc to shoot over props, pun intended. You will usually have to make an educated guess as to where your target is. In some cases, you will be able to see through the wall or prop, or use context clues like your HUD's objective indicator to help you aim your spam. Now that you're aware of the benefits of high ground, choke points, corners, and props, you will want to make sure your movement around the map takes these things into account. For example, when you're moving up into uncharted territory, try to avoid wide swinging corners. Instead, shoulder peek to make sure you aren't going to get surprised by somebody hiding in a corner or headshot by a sniper in the distance. Third and final pillar of demo positioning is the most difficult in my opinion, not only because it is the most complex, but also because it requires a lot of awareness to adhere to properly. At this point, you understand both spacing and map geometry, and how they help you be as effective as possible. Understanding these things will allow you to determine all of the good places on the map, but understanding the current game state will help you decide what good spot to use. Knowing the game state boils down to two things: game sense and awareness. I can't teach you these because they just come with practice, but I can talk about the key variables that determine the game state. First, the amount of map control your team has is important. If you are attacking on payload and the round just started, you are likely going to be playing close to your spawn entrance, trying to take control of key areas from the red team. Once you have pushed red back and are getting close to capping first, your ideal position is going to be more forward than when the round just started. This is similar for defending as well. Using upward last as an example, if your team hasn't lost tiles, then getting set up there is usually best. If your team is down a lot of players and cannot contest tiles with you, then you're probably best off standing in pub spot. Another important factor that I just hinted at is numbers advantage or disadvantage. This one is pretty easy since your HUD straight up tells you how many players are alive or dead for both teams. If your whole team is dead, then getting aggressive is typically a pretty bad idea. Conversely, if your team is up 6 players, then you should consider moving up and taking more space. Where your teammates are playing is yet another variable in this equation. If the majority of your team is playing in an aggressive position, then you should probably play near them. As a Demoman, you don't want to get caught alone because spies, scouts, or soldiers can ambush you and usually win the 1v1. Of course, the other team also affects your positioning. Pay attention to the other team's class composition. If they have no snipers, you don't need to respect sightlines. If they have 3 spies, be extra paranoid. Furthermore, how they are playing also plays a role. If the defending team is constantly getting aggressive, it might be best to play a bit passive and set up some traps as opposed to bringing the fight to them. The objective is yet another factor. How close is the cart to the end of the track? Are you risking getting backcapped if you push up now? You have to keep this in the back of your mind when deciding where to position. The final main variable that impacts the game state is your own team composition. If your team has 6 snipers, then you're probably screwed, but arguably your best play is to set up sticky traps and play passively in the hopes that your snipers will actually hit something. Compare this to if your team has 6 soldiers. In this case, you're more likely to be able to play aggressively since you have a bunch of teammates to back you up. Another class that should impact your positioning are friendly engineers, especially when they are running leveled sentries. Despite having a rocky relationship when they are on the opposing team, Demoman and Engie have good synergy when playing together. A leveled sentry gun solves Demoman's main weakness of getting ran at, and Demoman helps the engineer keep his buildings alive by locking down the areas that the other team would usually spam the sentry gun from. Just make sure that you and your team are playing in front of the sentry gun, because a sentry that is more forward than its team is usually a dead sentry in just a few seconds. On the topic of class synergy, Demoman just likes to have players with him to act as a bodyguard when he gets ran at, as well as a cleanup crew for when the demo deals a lot of damage. Classes like Scout, Pyro, and Heavy are good at both protecting the demo, as well as providing the chip damage to clean up low health enemies that Demo can sometimes struggle with himself. The reason I focused on Engineer so much for this bit was because sentry guns never miss, but casual players definitely do. Of course, I can't mention class synergies without pointing out medics. Obviously, every class benefits from having a good medic on their team, but I would argue that Demoman is enabled more than any other class with heals. That being said, you aren't always going to have the luxury of a pocket medic in a pub, and frankly, I am glad because where's the fun of getting healed 24/7? In the case that you do have a competent medic, do your best to get a full buff before getting aggressive. Obviously, there are times when you can't wait because of the objective or some other circumstance, but the difference between a 175 health demo and a 260 health demo is monumental. Lastly, it isn't a video talking about Demoman without mentioning ammo management. Similar to getting a buff before walking forward, you should try to make sure you have a lot of ammo loaded before getting aggressive. Your ammo count is often going to be a deciding factor in big team fights, so you want to make sure you're starting fights with as many projectiles locked and loaded. Even if you're being perfectly aware of your positioning and making sure to avoid overextending, there will still be times where you're caught off guard. TF2 is just a chaotic game. In these cases, you can oftentimes damage surf to safety. I won't get into too much detail about how to pull this off because I just made a video discussing surfing, but basically you jump and crouch as you're about to take damage and you will go flying. Earlier I mentioned how sticky jumping isn't very reliable during fights because you have to wait for the sticky arm period, unlike rocket jumping or shield charging which have no delay. Sticky jumping can still be useful during fights. Most of the time I find myself jumping to chase vulnerable targets that are alone, such as a retreating medic or engineer. Unlike bombing as a soldier, as a Demoman you will usually want to land a bit further away from your target so that they are at your ideal mid-range. You can still jump to rollout or to reposition, although the self-damage is pretty harsh. Usually jumping will deal around 1/3 your health, so landing near health packs is ideal. Speaking of health packs, you will want to control packs whenever possible. This is yet another reason why map control is super important. Having a health pack you can take at any time during a fight essentially gives you bonus health. The pillars of positioning assume that your team has at least a little bit of map control. You can't focus on spacing yourself properly from choke points, playing on the high ground, or using health packs to your advantage if you can't even leave your spawn. Luckily, Demoman is good at creating space for his team. The main way you do this is by, you guessed it, dealing damage. I would say there are two common scenarios where you find yourself in a situation where your team has no room. Firstly, at the start of a round on payload as the blue team. In this case, gaining some map control is usually as simple as carefully exiting your spawn. If red team is playing super close, you can corner peek them and force them to back up or die. Make sure you are abusing your resupply binds if necessary because this can save your life. The other common situation is on defense when your entire team wipes. This usually happens in my games when myself and my team overcommit to defending a point. Situations like these are basically the same as the blue team, but a bit harder because you also want to set up a lasting defense which usually requires you to venture away from the safety of your spawn room. This, frankly, ridiculous clip is an example of greed almost paying off. There's no way our heavy should have lived for so long, but that's just the power of arrow tanking. Here we end up losing the point, but I couldn't help but using this clip because it's just so funny. Points where the spawn is close to the defense are usually very hard for the attacking team to break. Think Upward Last, Badwater Last, and Borneo Last. This is in part due to because of the readily available spawn for the red team. There isn't too much specific advice I can give when it comes to taking space, since it essentially boils down to having good aim and movement fundamentals. The best tip I can give is to minimize the amount of time you spend in choke points for the same reason you want to fight your opponents when they are in a choke themselves. If I were talking about any other class, the guide would end here. However, there are a few things that Demo can do that the other classes can't, so I'll rattle those things off now. Since Demo has so much ammo and generous AoE, it is almost always worth it to shoot what I call safety stickies as you're moving around the map. The first reason for this is to abuse area of effect to check around a corner for any hiding opponents. If you hear a hit sound, there's someone there. Doing this will prevent you from wide swinging into a hiding heavy or anything like that. The second time I use this technique is also when I'm going around corners, but instead of using it to check a hiding spot, I'm using it as insurance in case an opponent was heading to the same spot. It is rare that this ever does anything, but when I do run into an unlucky timing where like a random Pyro is coming around the same corner as I am, it can turn the fight in my favor because I got a ton of early damage. Another ability unique to the Demoman is sticky traps. The ability to trap a shutter or door means that you can sometimes afford to be very greedy with your positioning. If you didn't know, sticky bombs suffer from normal damage falloff for 5 seconds before they do base damage, no matter the distance between them and the demo that shot them. This means that if you put down a sticky trap and detonate it less than 5 seconds later on an unsuspecting victim, the trap may not be lethal. In these cases, you can play very close to the trap to ensure maximum damage. I find myself doing this the most when I'm spawn camping. Lastly, I want to mention trading your life for an important pick. I've discussed this in depth for Soldier, and Demoman can occasionally get a good value trade. That being said, I would generally avoid trading as a Demoman. The amount of value you provide to your team alive is usually going to be greater than getting a med pick and then being stuck on a respawn timer. Anyways, I'm sure that I missed something, so let us know in the comments if you have any advice or questions. Thank you for watching the video. Holy shit.